Hi everyone, my name is Azzurra Cox. I'm an assistant professor here in the department, and I'm happy to introduce the astronaut panel. And we'll have our three speakers. First will be Christine Boyer. She is the William Kenan Professor of Architecture and Urbanism at Princeton University, and she directs the undergraduate urban studies certificate program there. Second will be Andrew Zolli. He is the Chief Impact Officer at Planet, a space and AI organization that has deployed the largest constellation of Earth-observing satellites in history. And then we'll round it out with Alvin Harvey. He is a Diné of the Navajo Nation and a postdoctoral fellow at MIT's Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And he focuses on Indigenous research methodologies and methods. So thank you all for joining, and we're looking forward to this.
Hello, everybody. I'm Christine Boyer, and I'm very glad to be here, and I thank Catherine very much for the invitation. I'm going to tell you the stories that Ian McHarg wrote about space travel, astronauts, and so forth. But I start out with, yes, let me not cover this. I start out with this quote from Luhmann. That might have been addressed to the great storyteller of Ian McHarg. And while I'm sitting in the audience, I realized I don't have a bombastic voice the way that Ian McHarg has. But I'll try to narrate this story as best I can. So all of this is Nicholas Luhmann, but also Rob Nixon, a colleague of mine at Princeton, could be telling you about the catastrophes of the environment. We need narration. We need stories to capture the slow violence of what is happening to the planet Earth. And I would add that, well, Ian McHarg may have been there way ahead of us as a great storyteller. So, in other words, from this quote, the non-human environment, nature, land, climate, animals, water, and so forth, can be a subject of social concern only when that concern has been communicated to the public. And everything that can be formulated linguistically can be communicated. Environmental storytelling began to focus in post-war America on how humans could survive on planet Earth. So what kind of story would, I'm one slide ahead of myself. But anyway, what kind of stories would Ian McHarg tell about the environmental crisis that the Earth faced in the late 1960s? Ian McHarg hoped to narrate a story about Earth and how the designer with nature had an ethical obligation to save it from ecological collapse. He would need antagonists in his narration, but he would need protagonists as well. There had to be hope that people would understand that land matters and that their actions toward it were essential. They must condemn the evils that complicity with Earth's destruction wrought. Creating an awareness of limits would lead to appreciation of possibilities. The two stories must interact: humanity's negative impact on the environment and the active intervention by steersmen of spaceship Earth. The Earth and technology must intersect in the drama of survival. So the image that dominated environmental thinking in America, and I want to stress it's in America, in the last half of the 20th century, was that of the green-blue planet, for the first time seen from outer space. The astronaut, William A. Anders, shot the now iconic image of Earthrise from the manned spaceflight of Apollo 8 and sent digital signals in air-to-ground transmission back to Earth on December 24, 1968. Reassembled into an image, human eyes saw the planet rising above the moon for the first time. The image was revelatory. And they also admit that they did not immediately understand the image as iconic as it became for all of us. So suddenly, the biosphere, the thin layer of air and water, soil and life enveloping the Earth, was the unsettling environment for the future of this delicate whole Earth. The image enabled the viewer to be an objective viewer, and an complicit participant in the maintenance of its fragile equilibrium. But it also is an image that speaks of technology and ecology becoming one interrelated system, a world where technological progress and ecological survival did not cancel each other out. The space program represented what science and technology could achieve. It also revealed problems created by humans imperiling themselves by their own creations. The isolated small Earth spinning on its axis in space was lonely, fragile, limited, and perishable. It must be handled with care. As the Earthrise photographs were beamed back to Earth, awareness also was ascending. This small green blue planet was the source and sustainer of life on Earth. Here is the convergence of two narratives: an ecological whole systems model of Earth and a cybernetic whole systems model of technology. This may be well, we're not going to go forward. This may be the narrative that Ian McHarg was searching for, a story to spark ecological awareness and global action intermixed with the marvels of techno-scientific achievement. As we shall see, both the astronaut and the ecologist shared the same aspirations: survival. At the beginning of McHarg's Space Odyssey narrative, he saw the role of humans as antagonists. Indeed, he thought they were a planetary disease, an epidemic, and a pathogen threatening the survival of Earth with extinction. They were certainly abetting the process of entropy. McHarg writes, he, man, treats the world as a storehouse existing for his delectation. He plunders, he rakes, he prisons and kills this living system, the biosphere, in ignorance of its workings and its fundamental value. Certainly, the military and corporate creators of napalm, defoliation, ICBMs, and biochemical warfare were pathogens. Let me get it straight. The bubonic plague, he writes, is a mere dandruff in comparison. McHarg would gather up all these arch destroyers and put them into rocket capsules and fire them into outer space on a long, indeterminate voyage. Isolated in a space capsule, immersed in an environment unhospitable for life, man would soon realize that he must not introduce any radioactivity into his capsule. He would cause a mutation, and his survival was contingent on there not being a mutation. He asked, who wants deformation? Who wants leukemia? And man would also learn that the capsule couldn't tolerate any DDT or any toxins at all because it was a recirculating system, and the stuff would soon enter his own system as well. Perhaps he would have a conversion and become the husbandman, the steward of the biosphere, helping to manage this work with its contingency upon the development of his apperception. That is, he gets to know the way the world works, and we have just observed that his view of the way the world works is a fallacy, an illusion, and has no survival value whatsoever. What McHarg's narrative of outer space is trying to say is that nature is not external to man. It cannot be exploited to serve economic growth without major repercussions. Humans make environments, but environments also make humans. The geological and biological surrounding cannot be shuffled about, for they are the supports of life. It is not man alone who is the antagonist, but corporations, the military, the government as well. McHarg developed his spaceship metonym for the planet Earth by retelling a story written by the anthropologist Lauren Isley, who also taught here at Penn in the late 1950s. Isley was also conceived that a man in space might one day look down on the Earth and see this small rotating orb, our ecos, or home, as green. Green from the maritime algae of the oceans, green from the verdure of the land. This green epidermis was an interesting biosphere supporting all of life. But then this man in space took a closer look and saw a number of blemishes discoloring the green with spots of brown, black, and gray. And from these blemishes, dynamic tentacles had expanded. And he realized that the pathological tissues in the world's life's epidermis was indeed the works of man, the works and cities of man. And he asked, is man a planetary disease? McHarg retells this space travel odyssey, hoping to prove his theory that ecological awareness promises survival of the whole Earth. He invented a thought experiment to rid the Earth of man as a planetary disease, and thereby avoid perpetrating his war on Earth. The ecological experiment would involve the creation of a space buoy that would float in space at the point where an object could remain relatively stationary because the gravitational pull of the Earth, the sun, and moon balanced each other's out. I haven't checked whether that actually is possible, but it is. Thank you. Okay, now I know. All right. So yes, such a location would enable the collection of cosmic debris and information on solar weather, gravitational forces, biorhythms, knowledge of the complexity and diversity of the atmospheric interactions. The space buoy had to be designed as a self-sustaining ecosystem sufficient to support life in outer space in dynamic equilibrium. And hence, it would contain a simulated farm ecosystem with the necessary environment supportive of food chains, systems of water purification, recycling of waste, provision of oxygen for temperature stabilization, for shelter against radiation. And man, the astronaut, would be selected not only to understand the scientific workings of the Earth, but to be the steersman of this life-supportive capsule environment. At first, in McHarg's story, man was arrogant, the inheritor of the Western anthropocentric view, believing that he was the center of the cosmos and that he could control nature. But he slowly gained a perspective, understanding, a different perspective, understanding that all the co-tenants of his space buoy were united in survival and evolution. They were intermeshed, sustaining one another and aspiring to systems equilibrium. With fresh understanding of the interdependency of his life support system, the astronaut was ready to accept his ethical responsibility and apply this new perspective to management of the world as an ecosystem when he returned to Earth. He would, without hesitation, see himself and his companions in the product of a great process, comprehensive through the past, with the future some unpredictable but amenable extension of past and present. The world was fit for life, life adapted to the world. The environment could be made more fitting. This appeared to be the role which the astronaut, man, would uniquely fulfill when he returned to Earth. Survival of the Earth was his first and overriding concern, not man against nature, not the Earth in the hands of armors of world life extinction through atomic holocaust, men who ignore the warnings of too much radiation and became the agents of evolutionary regression. The new perspective rejected the view of man as a planetary disease. But there was another ecological threat, the population balloon. The numbers of world population had to be controlled if the planet was to survive. The availability of resources was linked to these numbers of population. They were simply too many humans producing too much pollution and making too many demands on nature's resources. The brute numbers impacted the ecosystem with negative consequence. The task requires that these threats of evolutionary regression through mutation of excessive population numbers be surmounted as central problems in the task of making the Earth more fit and man more fitting. But this is another story, and it comes from the 120-minute documentary of Multiply and Subdue the Earth, in which McCarg is the main actor. That tries to explain the severe problem of overpopulation, and that story will have to wait. So he, man, came to realize that the world was an evolutionary process that had developed over unimaginable eons of time changing, adopting, recycling, tentative new forms, some of which persisted while others failed. Yet out of this trial, and indeed evolved this complex, elaborate, and magnificent world which man had so recently entered, the latest dominant species, planetary disease or prospective steward. McCarg imagined the world as a space capsule, and the price for survival was both the cost of understanding its ecosystems and the benefits of intelligent intervention. Man on Earth could arrest the inevitable path toward entropy and create a self-perpetuating and evolving ecosystem supportive of all physical and living processes. This is a central lesson of the workman's code, McCarg wrote, in the manual of the good steward. While space exploration may have generated useful knowledge to aid environmental impact analysis and climate modification and the atmosphere's amplifying feedback loops, but the closed ecology of the space capsule merely identified the self-destructive pathologies of man and provided a hopeful check on spoliation in order to return planet Earth someday to its natural equilibrium. Thank you.
Okay, here we go. Hello, everyone. How y'all doing? We're about to do a live fire IT experiment. My name is Andrew Zolli. It's so great to be here with you. I want to welcome you to, what time is it? 4:25, which you all know is the peak learning hour of the day. This is the asymptotic minima between the time you last ate and you will next pee. I want to congratulate you on your fortitude and your bladder strength. So thanks for being here. Let's see if that works. Yes, hi, wonderful. Okay, I have to apologize because we have come to this moment of the day a little later than planned. I actually have to depart because I have been talking to UN bureaucrats for the last 10 days. And I literally at the point where I'm almost at the point where I can't stand the sound of my own voice. If you will hear it for a few more minutes, then I have to rush to the airport and finally see my family. I'm Andrew Zolli. I'm what we call the Chief Impact Officer at an organization called, can you all hear me? An organization called Planet. We are, all of us here, in fact, right at the beginning when we were hearing about the history of this work, there was this wonderful little moment where we heard everything is form and process, right? Every form is the result of continuing adapting processes. And I thought about that throughout all of these amazing presentations that we've heard today. Just the lineages that attach to the moment we are in now. The ones we've heard about the history of this center, how many of them go back to this moment in the late 1960s to the early 1970s, the shift in perception, and how much these new tools and this new moment are informed by that, by our own cultures of practice and by our own understanding of ourselves in our institutional frames, in our cultural frames, in our familial frames. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what our organization does. And I just want to tell you, this is you've heard all of these wonderful academics, and it's really amazing work. I took so many notes. I'm not going to give you an academic talk at all, because I think you've earned that from, you guys are amazing, but come on, like we only have so much brain space, okay? And instead I want to start out by playing a little game with you, okay? And here it is. I'm going to play the game with you, and I want you to pay very careful attention. This is a game that only has one thing, okay, one rule. Here it is. I'm going to show you, we're going to play a little game about noticing change. And I'm going to show you two images on the screen, and they're going to flicker like this. Took me a long time to learn how to do that. Just like this. And here's the whole game. When you see the change, and I promise you there's one and only one change, I would like you to, when you honestly see it, I'd like you to gently and non-competitively, this is not about blocking out the people around you, raise your hand solely for the purpose of my counting you, okay? You got that? That's the whole game. Are you ready? There's one and only one change. I want you to pay attention and tell me when you see it. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Don't say it if you hear it, if you see it. Don't shout it out. 1. Okay, now, how many people here honestly saw no difference between those two images? Okay, I'd like you to meet the honest people here. I don't know what you were looking at over there. I'm just kidding. No, it's not like that. No, for those of you who didn't see it, and I want to tell you that the first time I was shown this, I didn't see it either. I'd like you to pay attention to this part of the screen, and I'd like you to watch as the thing that holds airplanes in the sky disappears in front of your eyeballs over and over and over again. Now, think about the context in which this little experiment happened. I'd like you to consider why you didn't see it. Why didn't you see it? Right? How many people here, just out of curiosity, started by looking at the tail of the airplane? See how many hands went up? Now, none of you spoke to each other. How about the uniforms of the soldiers? A whole bunch of hands go up, right? And none of you communicated, because that makes you exactly like everybody else. Human beings, first of all, are very good at looking for change. First, this is really important, very good at looking for change that moves at about 1 meter per second, like this, back and forth like this. Very bad at detecting change that moves like this, and also really bad at detecting change that moves like this. And especially bad at detecting change that moves like this in places where we don't expect it to occur. Your entire perceptual system has been evolved since for 4.5 billion years to pay attention to the things that we think heuristically are important and worth paying attention to. And the engines of airplanes don't normally disappear in front of our eyeballs. Now, this is important because think about all of the ways, what this lead to. It leads to a world in which we see the slow accumulation of potentially catastrophic change at the edge of human perception that comes slowly, 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 and then all at once. The wonderful thinker and compatriot and cohort member of all of the people we've been talking about today, Stuart Brand, who I know many of you will know, I think he captured this idea really wonderfully when he said, in our society, the fast-moving change gets all the attention, but it's actually the slow-moving change that gets all of the power, that has most of the power. Right? We pay a lot of attention to the new iPhone. So I'm going to show you two images on a screen. They're going to flicker back and forth in front of your eye. Maybe you've heard about this game. We just did it 2 seconds ago. I'm going to show you two images. I want you to raise your hand when you can see them. Okay, you ready? Here we go. So bump, 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 bump. I don't know, this difference is subtle. I'll slow it down, okay? Humanity has terraformed 75% of this planet that is absolutely the best planet. I want to tell you that, just so you all know, when Elon Musk says he really wants to go to Mars, there's a whole team of my colleagues at NASA who are working on one problem, which is when human beings leave the protective sphere of the magnetosphere, not the Earth's atmosphere. When they actually go, we have lots of humans living in low Earth orbit or medium Earth orbit, but to go to Mars, you have to leave that protective veil that blasts most of the sun's harmful radiation around the planet. And there's an overwhelming likelihood that every Martian visitor will get cancer on the route today. This really is the best of all possible planets. So we've now terraformed, we've terraformed 75% of the Earth, primarily for human habitation, 30% of it to grow food on the Earth. And these changes happen at the edge of our experience. They happen at the edge of systems. There was a wonderful point made, a critical point I think you made about whether or not the landscape practice is actually shaping the actual landscape, or what forces are shaping it. They certainly look like these. In fact, at planetary scale, this is a work of a cohort of Earth system scientists led by a very famous person at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, whose name is Johan Rockström, and colleagues have developed something called the Planetary Boundaries Framework. They've identified the 9 planetary systems that make it possible for life and human civilization to flourish. When they assessed this initially, 2 of the systems had been pushed past the planet's natural regenerative capacity, the natural tipping points where those systems are, where the normal dynamic biogeophysical processes on the Earth actually take care of change. In the most recent assessment, 6 of the 9 have been pushed past their essential critical tipping points. This is like cutting the threads in the rope that holds life together. And each one of these systems is at the periphery of your experience. None of you know when the ozone hole is better or worse, or whether or not the state of the biosphere is in a particularly difficult place. And even if we didn't have that problem, we have other forms of slow accumulation. And this is one of my favorites. This is from Walker Ashley and colleagues, called the expanding bullseye effect, which is, you can take the same disruptions, the same tornadoes and earthquakes and flood. You don't need climate change. You just need the population to grow. And as a consequence, the number of assets, the number of people, the amount of life that is put at risk just by our continued fluorescence on the planet creates more and more damage. That's why we see increasing numbers of damage from major events due to climate change, even if the climate wasn't changing. So, at this point, you should be happy that there are no sharp implements around. We took all those out of the room. This is a very depressing talk at this point. But I do want to draw attention to, and I was so incredibly inspired by the work that was presented earlier about the sort of narrative frames of ecological design. I kept trying to place where we are in this moment. I'm going to get to space stuff in a minute, but I do think it's worth noting that we are living in a place where the story is not one-dimensional. It's not just a narrative of loss and destruction. While it's true that we may be living through the 6th extinction, the 6th recorded time in the history of life on Earth when biodiversity has collapsed, and be of no mistake, the reason it's collapsing is because of us. In the kindergarten play of the dinosaurs and the asteroid, we would be cast as the asteroid. We are the instrument of destruction. We are not masters. We are weapons, right? And so that's a terrible reckoning that we face, but it's also true that we're living through the 2nd Renaissance. And the problem with the 6th extinction and with any of these things is that the numbers literally boggle the mind. The scale is too big for you to think about. If I told you there were 1 million species at risk, you can't think about 1 million species because you can't think about 1 million anything. Nobody can. The numbers are just too big. But it's also true that on the other side, we have this set of tools that are expanding human capacity as never before, and they are self-compounding and accelerating, and some of them are moving faster than that crisis. And in that schism, I can tell you a whole bunch of evidence on the left-hand side of the screen that if you're a pessimist will confirm all of your cognitive biases. If on the other hand you are a techno-utopian optimist, which I will be clear with you, I am not, I can give you lots of evidence for why you should have optimism. And if you are simply confused or feeling vertiginously nauseous as a consequence of the shearing forces between that story, there's lots of evidence for you too. And indeed, actually, I think of the work that you do and the increasing recognition of the kind of living dynamism of systems and the need to work with the living dynamism systems, and that beautiful chart, which has already been recognized in the back of the room, and all this other great work, all of the furniture that we have been granted to sit around and think on that represents all of these ideas. This is really what we need. We need systems that allow us to build regenerative capacity, so capacity that builds upon itself and senses emerging risks and responds to disruption and engages in learning and transformation. We need actually connections between all of those things. By the way, this is a dynamic model of resilient living systems. It's true of the cells in your body. It's true of the actors in a complex adaptive system like an ecosystem. All of these things are happening at one time. We are but a piece of that. We are neither master to it nor ultimately slave, but we are components. But in order to do this work, one of the critical things that's needed is information. You have to, at every stage, you actually need to know the state of the system. I work with people who are rocket scientists. They say things like, they don't say it's not rocket science, they say it's only rocket science. And I'm like, settle down. Okay? The rest of us are a little intimidated. And so the thing, when you're building a satellite that looks at the Earth, one of the first things you have to do is that in addition to whatever its primary payload is, you have to instrument that system with sensors that are monitoring the forces of change that act on the satellite, at least as fast as those forces of change are unfolding. Otherwise, the system could spin out of orbit. You could lose control of it. Well, I have news for everybody. You live on a satellite. It just happens to have 8 billion other astronauts on it, as we've heard over and over again, implied metaphorically throughout these presentations. We need to monitor change at least as fast as that change is occurring on the Earth. So the problem is satellites are big and crazy expensive. They take decades of planning. They're very conservatively built. So a group of young NASA engineers about 15 years ago said, we want to do something different. They went down to Best Buy. You've all heard of Best Buy, right? You know, and they bought a stack of these things. And they went back to the lab. They took the guts out of the phone. And they built a tiny little satellite you could hold in the palm of your hand, and they secretly gave it to an astronaut who was headed to the International Space Station on the next mission. And they said, could you take this with you and throw it out the airlock when you get there to see how your phone does in space? And they got caught like a month before. They literally found a bulge in her spacesuit. They were like, what's that? She's like, nothing, nothing, nothing. They almost all got fired. They didn't get fired, but they let this mission go forward. She got up to the ISS, and they did actually throw it out the airlock, and it turns out your phone does great in space if it's shielded correctly, and it has a camera and a computer and a GPS and a radio. It has all the things a big satellite has in a tiny little package because we spent $1 trillion or so here on Earth to shrink these things down to the size that you could hold in your hand. And that led to a revolution in the design of satellites. Little satellites that are about the size of a loaf of bread, and we've put hundreds of them in a specialized orbit. Now, if you can imagine, there's the sun over there, here's the Earth. The Earth is spinning around like this, it's on a slight tilt. This is hundreds of satellites that spin from pole to pole, and they collectively, as the Earth turns sideways underneath them, line scan the planet every day. So everywhere you've ever been, at roughly lunchtime, we image down to a resolution of a few meters. That's not enough to read your newspaper, but it's enough to see every tree crown on Earth. It's enough to see every road, the health of every crop. It's a continuous observation system for the whole Earth at a resolution that is both privacy protecting and, especially important, allows us to act at the most local level, to contextualize the actions that we all need to take. So what do we do with all that data? We also have instruments that can zoom in when it's really needed down to about 30 centimeters. That's about the size of you sitting in your chair. We still don't know who you are. But we could see that there were people in this room, for instance. We can also use these tools for monitoring really important change. There's other stuff we're going to do too. I'm going to show that in a second. But just what we do is we use the tools of artificial intelligence. So, this is what I want you to see. If you remember I showed you the sixth extinction, the second renaissance? This is what's happened on the second renaissance side of the equation, right here, okay? It's taking these and creating global planetary scale monitoring, but not to understand the whole planet, but rather to help you understand what's happening in your piece of it. And then we use the tools of artificial intelligence to extract the essential patterns from those data sets. So for instance, right now, we're doing this huge project with our colleagues at the Microsoft AI Lab and a world-renowned public health institution called IHME, the Institutes for Health Metrics and Evaluation. They produce canonical data about the world's disease burdens, about COVID, about where the risk is. And what we're doing is we're extracting the highest resolution maps of where all the humans are. And that's a foundational layer to understand that we can do on a daily, weekly basis. Again, we're not tracking people. We're not even tracking whole populations. What we're really trying to understand is the spatial distribution of risk. Here's an example. This is the fourth largest city in Niger. It's called Zinder. It was last had a census in 2012 and has never been monitored since. Here's all the new growth that's happened in this city. That's where all the new people are. It's where all the new infrastructure is, all the new humans are. And what you can do with that kind of data is like this. This happens to be a map of the population density of Kenya. We can take the population density over time, where are people and where are they moving, and begin to layer in climate-induced migration and food insecurity and disease burden, and begin to unpack and understand the forces of change between those different layers, unpacking sort of 21st century, the kind of complex 21st century risks that we need to act. And let me show you what it means to act. So this is a little corner like Zinder. It's a place called Dolo Ado in Ethiopia. This was the population density of this place in 2017. Here it is in 2022, and there's the flood risk. This is a peak flood risk in this area. You can literally see where people are moving toward risk unknowingly. Because all of this, the first step of all this is to make the invisible visible. And that is a central thing. Watching people make these paintings was so inspiring. There were like photographs that someone showed, like people on ladders. Do y'all remember that? Right? These things are beautiful, and they are helpful, but they are also static. And so the question is, can we make our maps move as fast or faster than the problem? I'm going to give you a couple other examples just really quickly. One is a thing we do with a group called Climate Trace. This is a group of technical and academic institutions backed by Al Gore. They monitor coal-fired power plants and many other sources of information. Now, coal-fired power plants are highly variable. They turn on and off. They're huge sources of emissions, and they're not reported. So what you'll see here is me zooming in to a little place in Uttar Pradesh, India, down to one of these plants. And what you'll see is a black squiggly line, right? You see this little black squiggly line? That's how much carbon is coming out of that plant as monitored by these instruments. But since we can do it for one, we can do it for every coal-fired power plant on Earth. Last year at the Climate Summit, our friends at Climate Trace released this model of 352 million sources of unreported emissions around the world. So an era of radical climate transparency is being born in front of our eyes. And these are open digital public goods that belong to everybody, so they don't belong just to some proprietary special set of well-positioned actors. And we're doing all kinds of other things, but in the interest of time, I want to just very quickly move on to show you the stuff we're doing in biodiversity. Here we're publishing major scientific papers that take analyses of where in the world all the rarest and most at-risk biodiversity is, and identifying the roughly 16, nearly 17,000 places on the planet that are the last refuges of the most important, the most best understood picture of what we have for biodiversity risk. So this is down to a few meters, understanding where biodiversity is most at risk from a species rarity perspective. So if we can illuminate people and carbon and nature, we can begin to think about acting differently. So how do we act? And this is I want to just get to the action side of this, because it's not just about making beautiful maps, it's about what we do, what we design, how we build systems that live in continuous relationship with these kinds of capabilities. So I want to just show you one very simple thing. This is stuff that everybody here will know. In the grand connected giant hairball of interconnected global issues. We'll just start with a simple one. I think you mentioned it about population, which we weren't going to get to in this, but I just mentioned, okay, so we start with population growth over here. We're adding 1 billion people to the earth in the next decade or so. That in turn is driving vast new demand for agriculture. In fact, the need for agricultural land is the single greatest driver of deforestation on the earth. That need for driver of agriculture is itself driving deforestation, and that deforestation, the cutting down of the trees, is driving increased pandemic risk, because those places where the wildland and agricultural land meet are the places where diseases jump from wildlife to humans to livestock and vice versa. They ping pong around there. Now, we don't know where COVID came from, but I can guarantee you that that's where SARS-CoV-1, MERS, all of those other ones came from. And it's also, of course, driving climate risk. So what do we do? Well, if you look down at an agricultural landscape like this, to the human eye, all of that looks green, but the reality is we can sense that this part of the field needs water, or this part of the field needs fertilizer, and this part doesn't. We can get vastly more precise. This is in an industrialized, sort of developed agricultural sense. The opportunity in smallholder context is actually much greater, because the opportunity to leverage the power of information, and that's what we're doing, leveraging the power of information to decrease the socio-ecological intensivity of this activity by applying it only where it's needed. In fact, this is a variable rate sprayer that operates down the street. I live in Minnesota. This particular sprayer is talking to a satellite and getting a signal about precisely what to do where. And the reason that's valuable is because every liter of nitrogen-based fertilizer that we don't have to make in a heavy hydrocarbon facility or move to the field, apply to the field, have it run off the field, and then into the Mississippi River, and then down the Gulf of Mississippi, where it creates a dead zone the size of New Jersey, where literally nothing can live. Every little chip we can take away from that is something that creates this positive feedback loop. But let me show you this other one. And I know I didn't know if feedback loops were dirty words. There was a moment there I wasn't quite sure. If maybe, I'm very pro feedback loop. I just want to be careful if we can design them the right way. Okay, so let me show you one other example, because I really want you to see this. This is what deforestation looks like deep in the Amazon. I want you to watch as it spreads across the landscape there from right to left. Do you see it? We've just taken a few weeks of it and sped it up here. But here's what I want you to see, okay? That's where your eye goes to, and that's where my eye goes to, just like the people on the plane with the soldiers. But watch what happens on the left-hand side. Right after that deforestation occurs, you'll see these little spider webs. Those little spider webs are the illegal roads that go in reliably before the next round of deforestation occurs, because you can't deforest without equipment, and you have to put the equipment in the forest. Well, we've trained the tools of artificial intelligence to actually go in and find those roads automatically. And then with a partner in Brazil, we built a tool for the Brazilian government that actually audits the entire Amazon on a daily basis and finds every single act of deforestation as it's occurring and turns that information into human validated, because you want humans in the loop for accountability, human validated warrants for the environmental police. And in the last 12 months, the scarce resource, which in the agricultural context is the fertilizer, but in the deforestation context is the environmental police. In just the last 12 months, the Polícia Federal in Brazil have deployed more than 4,000 agents and over 300 joint operations, destroyed more than 1,000 machines in the field, which is what they're doing here, collected $3 billion in fines and cut the interannual rate of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon in half. That's what it means to interdict in a system with precision that is all predicated on having the right kinds of information. But it is not just about stopping the film strip of doom. It is also about turning the story around. And this is one of my last examples for people who love landscapes. You know, this is a denuded landscape. One of the things everyone knows here is that when you denude a landscape and then you bake it, it turns into something that's hydrophobic, right? Water pools on the surface, and that water at the surface doesn't help things grow. So this group in the Netherlands works in Tanzania and a bunch of other places to help people dig these bunds. They're the starting point of breaking the surface of the drum. And what they're able to do is actually create the context for the regreening of the landscape just by creating that variability. You can actually see it here, but the thing that's really important is that you can see it from space in a way that's scientifically validated and peer reviewed. So we can actually detect with our satellites, you can actually see that little, if you see that little 3 boxes up there, that little white unusual polygon is where they're building these things called buns. And you can literally, over the next 3.5 years, watch the restoration of the landscape. We can see through our sensors that the amount of water in the soil has increased, that the temperature has gone down, and the greening has increased. All of those things are possible when you are able to measure them. You can incentivize them. You can say, hey, I will encourage you, I'll reward you for engaging this activity, or I'll decrease costs in some other part of the system if you're able to engage in these kinds of activities like we have with carbon credits. Now, I'm not suggesting market responses for everything by any stretch. This isn't about that. It's just about what we can see is the kind of thing we can encourage. The last thing I want to say to you is this. I don't know about metaphors of control, which permeate discussions about ecological design. This would be like, me talking about that would be like talking to Stradivarius about violins. You know, there's a lot of bright bulbs in this room. But I'd like to give you a different metaphor. And that metaphor is one that other ecologists in the animal population world ask, which is, why do humans and bees and birds and fish and many other species flock together? Why? Because you'd think from a predation perspective, being together makes you a really nice meal for a large predator, right? So why on earth would you do that? It seems very counterintuitive. Well, the best hypothesis as to why we do that is because when all those fish and birds and bees and humans are in a place where they're together, their ability to create a kind of participatory panopticon happens. So this individual's view of danger overlaps slightly with this individual's view of danger, and this one, and this one, and this one. And so in 360 degrees, that's why the fish suddenly dart out of the way when the shark jumps through. You ever seen that? That's why, because they are connected to each other, which is an information problem. So the thing we're trying to do is encourage a collective understanding of these things, not at the level of command and control, patriarchal, commercial, market-oriented, et cetera, pre-colonial power structures, but in a truly collective sense to drive safety, collective safety, and collaboration and participation with the world and not over it. So I would just say, thanks.
Yate, shike do shidine, she Alvin Harvey yanishia. To bajna ajanisme, hananahi bashichin, bligana dashiche. Ado kia ane dashinale. Kot ego de nahastin isle. Hello everyone, my name is Alvin Harvey. I'm of the Diné people, also known as the Navajo Nation. I did my undergrad at New Mexico State University in mechanical engineering, and I've been at MIT now for 7 years. Did my master's, my PhD, and now doing a postdoc there. So MIT is the land of the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, and the Nipmuc people, so I must honor and remember them, and it's an honor to be here speaking in the land of the Lenape as well. Now, Professor Sievit has been introducing me as an astronaut. I unfortunately left my spacesuit at home. It wouldn't fit in my suitcase, so I apologize for that. But I've been really struck by this conversation here over the past 2 days. And me coming from an engineering background, I apologize, but my slides are very simple and frank. And I wish I would have prepared something a little bit more visually dazzling. But I think this is also an exercise and an opportunity to help both of us practice this understanding of oral tradition. So me coming from an Indigenous community, and I also will say that I can't speak for all Indigenous communities, nor can I speak for the Navajo Nation as a totality either. There's a whole diversity of different people. There's a whole diversity in my own community. You'll get different ideas about even how to pronounce coffee in Navajo, which is a long enduring conversation between the East and West Navajo Nation. But there's a diversity of knowledge within that. but there are also shared principles as well, which I'll discuss here. Now, going back to being struck by the conversation here, I must say that a lot of the ideas of designing with nature, of living in harmony with nature, and trying to understand and grapple with this relationship that we as human beings or as five-fingered beings have with nature, is something that's so complex. And there's been a lot of work, within the past 70 years, in part due to this photo that was discussed in the earlier discussion, of the fragility of our Earth, our planet, our home, and how it also contrasts with the lunar environment here, which, as you can tell, and as it was spoken about years ago, you can see something that's so living and brilliant versus something that appears to be so lifeless and dead. So what I'm struck by with the conversations over the past couple of days again is this idea that a lot of these ideas are novel. The understanding of living with the environment, of listening to these complex systems, of attempting to live in harmony with our environment. Now, these ideas have been enduring long before I have been here and long before my people even emerged into this universe here. So these ideas aren't necessarily novel, although I am happy to see them become more proliferated. Now, one other thing I've been struck by too is that MIT people are just everywhere, my goodness. And go Beavers for my MIT people out there. And the beavers are nature's engineers, so it's naturally become our mascot at MIT, unfortunately. But MIT, has this real long history with Indigenous people and Indigenous science. And many of those engineers that went on to go on to influence the fields of landscape architecture, influence even aerospace engineering, were in some way also influenced by Indigenous engineers, Indigenous science. But MIT's history too endures today with Indigenous science. And for the first time in its 160-year history, has actually hired Indigenous faculty. So these aspects of, not necessarily criticism, but understanding our relationship with each other is not so much a flat criticism, but more a welcome to relationship and a welcome to kinship. And as I introduce myself in my people's language, I introduce my four clans, essentially who my people are, who my relatives are, who my grandfather is, who my grandmother is, and where my mom and my father come from. And the reason that we do that, and this is something that is a shared Indigenous principle, the reason we do this is to find our relatives, to establish kinship, to go back to that centering of relationality. And relationality, coming into the worlds of science, of engineering, means that we're all related, that we're all interconnected, and that our environments are not necessarily living and unliving like the moon and the earth, but all things are living and all things are related to us. And they don't just have an instrumental value to us, but they have intrinsic value to us, just as we all have intrinsic value to each other. So on that note, I'd like to just speak a little bit more about the relationship that Indigenous people have, not just to our environment here, Earth ecologies, but also space ecologies as well. So just as the Kanaka Maoli have been using the stars for eons to be able to navigate the oceans, to be able to travel and see their relatives, to be able to transport goods, to transport ideas as well, ceremonies, all Indigenous people in some way, some form, have been relating to the stars in that way. So while our traditions are steeped in the context of our homelands, a concept of locality, that one thing that we all share as Indigenous communities and people, as I've been told by Anishinaabe elders as well as my own community elders, is this idea that we share the stars. And while our view of the stars will be different depending on our homelands, depending on where our people are, we share those stars and we each have unique perspectives of them. But again, there are these concepts of shared principles, of shared stars. And navigation is one of those. And I don't just mean navigation in the physical sense, in the sense of going one place to the other, but navigation in the way that we should live our lives, the way that we should build relationships with each other and with our environment. So When I say environment, I don't just mean the plants and the animals. I also mean what you might consider the abiotic, the non-organic, the stones, the mountains. All these things possess life. They all possess a metaphysical quality that relates to us. And these aren't necessarily just superstitions that come out of nowhere and that aren't or that are anti-science, I should say, but actually they are informed by generations of living with those relatives, living with that relationship, and they're informed by these socio-ecological systems that have allowed us to live in harmony, but not in a static sense, but in a way that reacts to these in relationships. So there's a dynamic sense to our movement with those relationships that is also mirrored in the stars. So we navigate spiritually, physically, emotionally, morally, ethically, all these different ways that we use the stars to navigate. And when the stars hold that much power, when we have such a strong relationship with them as Indigenous people, as Diné people, it also gives them a quality of life. It gives them a quality of not being way up there, but of being here as well, being here amongst us. So you hear our people call the moon grandmother. You'll hear the stars be referred to as ancestors. And it doesn't just mean in a metaphysical sense. It means that these are the beings, and I'm sure all of you had grandparents, brothers and sisters, and people that you look up to. These are the beings that we look up to for guidance. These are the beings that chart our paths, that hold our knowledge of the past and hold that knowledge to allow us to move forward together. And one thing that runs aground when it comes to some of these conversations, and particularly in the engineering space, which I've been involved with for space technology for several years now, is, well, that information, that data, it is superstition, and maybe we can come to accept some of those shared principles about living ethically and morally in space, and as it relates here on Earth too. But the moon itself, again, is still an unliving being. And you saw that earlier this year when the Navajo Nation protested a private space company being funded majorly by NASA sending ashes of actually several cremated individuals and a few pets to the moon. Now, that particular spacecraft never made it to the moon, but it mirrored an instance going all the way back to 1998 in which the same thing had happened. NASA had decided to honor a really renowned planetary scientist named Eugene Shoemaker and put a portion of his cremated remains on a spacecraft called Lunar Prospector. Now, as that spacecraft was being launched on the day of, they made a public release of it, and the Navajo Nation president at the time, Albert Hale, found out through one of his council members and made a really inflammatory public statement against NASA. Now, NASA is very publicly oriented and doesn't want to look bad in front of the masses as well, but actually made a promise to be able to go out to the Navajo Nation, to have a conversation, and to sit down and understand the concerns. So there was no science versus anti-science conversation at that time that we still see today. But there was a willingness and an attempt to be able to build a relationship of understanding about, why was there a difference about the morals, the ethics, and even the spiritual component of this particular science craft. So at that time, NASA decided to send the congregation out to the Navajo Nation, where they actually participated in ceremony, they actually participated in conversations with elders, youth, community members, and actually participated in what you call a talking circle. So they sat down in Piñon, Arizona, NASA people, Lakota people, Diné people, sitting together and coming to an understanding that while there's a difference, there is still potential for partnership, potential for understanding, and that Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous star knowledge, can come together with with Western science. And so that fusion, that braiding or that two-eyed seeing, is what we see a little bit more today, though there's still an undercut of philosophical difference. And again, going back to this concept of what is living and what is unliving. And I'd like to bring up these brilliant scholars. And when it comes to our understanding of interacting, of doing science in space, what is undercutting that is the philosophy of science. is a philosophy of interacting with our non-terrestrial environment, our astrophilosophy. Now, this isn't a term that I necessarily coined or anything like that, but it is a term that I work with in being able to both differentiate but also bond the indigenous philosophies that allow us to relate to our environment here on Earth. So one of the core concepts of indigenous philosophy when it comes to environmental science, when it comes to relating to our environment, or just designing with our environment, is this understanding that everything is connected. And I've heard a bit about that today with some of the conversations and talks as well, that everything being connected and having this complex system also means that that complexity is so difficult to understand. Now, in an indigenous worldview and an indigenous concept, and in the tellings, not necessarily the stories that are passed on from generation to generation, but the tellings allow us to be able to congregate and bring together these eons and generations of socioecological data and knowledge, and being able to bring those greater meaning and pass those on through an oral system of knowledge. And that allows us to be able to understand these complex systems that are all interconnected. So what might seem like a simple story or superstition are not relevant. I think I heard a comment earlier today that because a lot of these systems of knowledge aren't written out, that it also means they're just terribly complex to understand. And that is really by design. These systems of knowledge, indigenous systems of knowledge, are meant to be transferred, to be understood through a system of relationship. And relationships take a lot of time and a lot of energy. And I'm sure many of you have worked with communities, understand how much energy that takes to be able to invest into those, build them, and sustain them too. So not just everything is interconnected in terms of knowledge, in terms of systems, but also in terms of relationship. So this concept of relationship, relationality being centered in the way we do science, both here on Earth and in space, is really core to our astrophilosophy, our philosophy of understanding the world. Now, again, going back to that concept of everything is living in the universe as well. Now, this is something I think you can all relate to if you go out, hiking or into the environment, that, there is something there that really speaks to you, that enjoyment of being amongst nature, of enjoyment of being amongst life, the mountains, earth, all these different aspects that I think are inherent. Just as much as looking up to the stars relates to us, that speaks to us, that draws us to it, we also have this inherent nature of appreciating and loving our environment too. Now, through that relationship, through that environment, indigenous people have been living in that for eons. And it was really easy, it was really just made common sense that those relationships facilitated kinship, and that kinship facilitated an understanding that those things are also living, that they have their own will, that they have their own spirit, that they have their own agency, going from the smallest microbial all the way to the largest mountains to celestial bodies. And what this meant also was that it wasn't the duty, or it wasn't even the responsibility, or even anything empowering man or humans to be able to dominate and control these things. But there was a system of relationality and a system of reciprocity too. And this reciprocity meant that there was always the aspect of asking for permission. There was always an aspect of consulting with the elders, with the community. And this aspect that, we aren't on a hierarchy so much, but we're in a web of relationships, going back to that aspect of everything is connected. So I just highlight some of these aspects. I apologize if that's hard to read, but to reiterate some of my concepts of life is kinship, Earth and space ecologies are united, purposes of knowledge seeking, and this concept of locality. So as we created this relationship with our environment, it also meant that the space environment isn't way out there, but again, is closer to our hearts, is closer to our environment here. So the conventional understanding today is that space begins at 100 kilometers in the air at the Kármán line. But in reality, our ecologies, as we understand them, extend all the way out into the universe. And when we take that perspective, that also means that we take that aspect of stewardship, of relationship, of understanding, of care, all the way out into the universe. And our responsibilities as we carry them, that knowledge also extends to people that travel off Earth too. Now, when we travel off Earth as Indigenous people, as community members, there's a purpose of traveling. There's a purpose of journeying. And that purpose isn't to extract. That purpose isn't to spread ourselves to different places to be able to ensure that other humans or other beings survive. But the whole purposes of our science, our understanding, our living in the world is to be able to be good relatives. And so being good relatives means that as we go into the universe, into the world, that we carry that knowledge of our ancestors, those tellings, that information, that ecological understanding, and albeit that those principles that are rooted in the locality of that land, of where our people are from, don't transport directly to another location. Those principles and those understandings are carried with us as well. So those principles and understandings we carry with us to these different localities that influence our relationship with the land as well. Geez, I really apologize. This is supposed to be black again. I'm really like, killing it with the visuals on this and following up with the previous conversations as well. But I think I'll keep my conversation or my sharings with you a bit shorter. And I think what's at the heart of this understanding of relating to our environments is that we come into these environments as guests. We come into these non-terrestrial environments as relatives. And what really matters is our intention. And what really matters is also the tools that we select. So there's a difference between our methodology and methods. And methodology is about the philosophies, the ways that we decide to select our tools or methods. And that has been influenced by Western science, by these different philosophies that we've been talking about today. And the methods that we choose are wielded by those methods are wielded by those methodologies that we have. Now, again, going back to that concept of kinship, of relationality, of speaking with our hearts, it also means that as we travel, as we go to different places, it's always about that reciprocity, about asking for permission. And even if it is something like designing a new housing block or designing a park or anywhere else, is that there are Indigenous people there, there are Indigenous beings that are there as well. And being able to listen to them, to be able to facilitate that conversation, there are also people that have been living there for eons that have been facilitating that conversation, that have been facilitating that understanding, that listening. So including the Indigenous voice in these conversations about how do we improve this ecological site, or how do we go into the stars in a good way, as we say, how can we do that in a way that is informed to the best of our knowledge, informed by all of this data and information? And who holds that data again is Indigenous people. And that data and information is again open to us through relationship. So again, I apologize here again, but one of the core concepts that I think intersects all of us as we think about what it means to be off Earth, to be Indigenous, or to be an engineer, a scientist, an architect, is that we have these intersections now that we want to understand our Earth environments, we want to understand our space environments, and our futures with them. And what helps us facilitate those in a good way when we begin to involve the Indigenous voice, Indigenous knowledge, is bringing those together and just having the ability to listen with our hearts, to listen with our minds, and to be able to help bring those conversations to the fore in whatever discipline that we might be in as well. So I apologize. I will send these out with the correct coloring. I think it's a little bit more legible and readable in that way. But I really want to thank everyone for their time. And I was hoping to keep this short because I prefer to do a conversation and respect some oral tradition in that way. And I love being able to have a conversation and just talk with people as opposed to coming up here and kind of lecturing in this way. But I appreciate it and thank you so much.
Wow, that was amazing. What an amazing panel. Really, really. Sorry? Yeah, we're only two. Unfortunately, Andrew had to leave. So he kind of dazzled us and then made his exit. But yeah, just like I was really struck by the breadth and the power of all of your presentations. Um, and yeah, I guess I'd want to start with you. Actually, I think Christine, you mentioned the overview effect, and that was a question I kind of have been mulling over. The idea that the astronaut's view, the so-called astronaut's view, like from above, is afforded to very few of us as a firsthand experience, but it's relayed to so many, both through image and through lore and storytelling. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the role of narrative in this jump from the individual experience to the collective, and whether you think anything is lost or gained in that translation.
Does this work? Yes. Always something is lost in translation.
Or gained also.
And gained too from a different perspective. But I, was thinking about you talking about kinship and relationships and yes, now I'm going to think of something else. But I'm blocking what I want to say.
You can spin off however you want.
Ask me the question again.
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering the role of narrative
I know what it was.
and what's lost or gained.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about your talk, and I was thinking about Rob Nixon talking about we need narration. But who is the we need narration? To talk about slow violence in poor environmental justice issues because the catastrophe is so large we can't understand it we can't visualize it, we can't see it. But I was thinking of communities that can tell you what the damage to the environment is, can narrate their own stories. So it isn't that we need those stories. We need to gather other people's stories. We need to think about citizen scientists and think of ways how they can be respected in law courts when there is environmental justice issues. So the question was really one of turning it upside down in a way and saying, it isn't that we educated and knowledgeable professional people need to tell these stories. We need to hear the stories from others. So that's why I was thinking. And probably I blocked the answer because it was kind of rejecting the question in a way.
Yeah, I think what struck me about the previous talk was this idea of these things are happening on the peripheral. And there are many communities where it's not just happening on the peripheral, it's happening right here. It's happening right in front of them. And we need those narratives. And I think a lot of indigenous communities are right in the center, though they might appear on the peripheral for most people. Like those indigenous people there are dealing with these climate disasters, dealing with these flooding and everything else like that, societal concerns, socioeconomic concerns, and bringing their narratives forward, not just as something that's happening in the now, but understanding the history and understanding the creation story of those conditions, as well as those connections with some of the traditional ecological knowledge that those people have, is something that's very important and powerful. Now, those come with a caveat of data sovereignty, which is this understanding that traditional knowledge, whether it's through the language or whether it's through the experiences of indigenous people, should be monitored, controlled, and shared in the way that they want it to be presented as well. So I'm in agreement there that we need a greater sense of narrative, and particularly when it comes to space travel or developing space technology, I think we collectively deserve a better narrative than us going there to escape Earth or to evolve as humanity or to go and colonize. That today, I think with our collective wisdom and knowledge and experience, we can articulate a vision for space that is both responsible, wise, and something that speaks to us in the now and that will speak to future generations too.
Let me just add a little footnote. I think Anne Winston Spirn spoke a little bit about what she could offer Ian McHarg, and one of the things was she began to talk to the community residents, and And she said to us today, and that's what he was interested in, all of a sudden, that's what you can add. So I think it's not a new idea particularly, but it may be one we have to be reminded of over and over again, especially as our technology, our artificial intelligence, and we get in love with what we can do from technology's point of view, but not necessarily from communitarian point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, Andrew's talk in particular, just kind of made me ask that. It makes me wonder, and again, it's not about being anti-science or pro-science, but, you have this extremely powerful technology that basically reduces these very complex systems to pixels, and it can be to great end, it can, they're using it for good. But then when you talk about Alvin, these networks of kinship, it strikes me that they're ephemeral, they can't be mapped. I mean, they're essentially unmappable. They're alive, right? They're kind of life forms in themselves. And so I'm just wondering, from the design standpoint, but also just in general, I mean, how do we, I mean, are the tools of the astronaut, which are kind of, maybe represented by in one form by Andrew's technology. How can those interact? How can they, or can they interact and layer with these very ephemeral live networks of kinship?
Yeah, I think, as you said, these things are living beings in themselves, and knowledge itself is a living being too. It has its own agency, and you develop your own relationship with it. And I think part of what we struggle with, going back to that idea of narrative, is you know, being worried or being turned off in a way from understanding those relationships through different lenses, in particular with Indigenous knowledge. And building that relationship again, as I was speaking about, and really hammered home the point, maybe too much. So I apologize if all of you are already aware of a lot of these things, but one of the ways that our communities or people are taught is through elders and people that are knowledge holders and sit down and speak with you. And being prepared to listen, I think, is a skill that's tremendously difficult and hard, and even for Indigenous people sometimes too. And listening to the complexity of our people, because we all have our own diaspora. We all have our own people that are trained with Western science, that really love engineering. You have people that are more traditional, that are like, I don't want to use those types of tools. They've been so destructive. And I think being able to weave those together, even just within a community, or within a community, and then having allies and scholars too, it requires a great deal of listening. It requires, honestly, what I've found is it requires ceremony in a lot of ways. And ceremony for Indigenous communities comes in different forms. It can be as simple as offering gifts. It can be a talking circle. It can be in the participation of a larger gathering with singing, with tobacco, with sage. All these different aspects that allow us to come together, beyond kind of our name tags or beyond like our suit jackets, but connecting heart to heart and being able to listen in that way is tremendously challenging, and it takes time. Now, with the tools of Western science, like using satellites, with the tools of an astronaut, for example, that different operational experience, I think one thing that we run into a lot is appreciating Indigenous knowledge, but trying to integrate that into the system, and that doesn't always work. Being able to, again, going back to that idea of weaving, or what Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall has said before, being able to see the world with two eyes, one eye with Western science, the benefits of that, and another eye with Indigenous science and the benefits of that. It gives you that whole rounded understanding of the problem and also the evolving solution too. So being able to weave them together and not necessarily extract Indigenous knowledge and place it within a Western knowledge system, but even being able to center that Indigenous knowledge and build from that and use those tools of the astronaut, of the scientist, of the engineer, to be able to benefit these communities, and also just to be able to benefit the people that are involved in the system too. I think we run into this problem in bioastronautics of we design things for humans, but we often forget the human too, which is a really interesting design issue. But being able to design not just for the human, but for the designers themselves, the people that are involved in the systems and all their relatives and relations. So also thinking non-human about it too, I think just goes back to that aspect of not condensing, but being able to make legible those eons of experiences and lessons learned too. So Indigenous knowledge isn't always, this is how it's done because it worked in the past, but it's also, this is how it should be done because we've made these mistakes before. And I've heard a lot of elders, they're Eastern Shoshone, Diné, that are saying, given the current climate crisis, that we've been here before. And there is knowledge and tellings that are actually lessons learned that have been gifted to us by our elders and ancestors that can help us not make those same mistakes as before.
Okay, I think we're going to end it there, but thank you so much, Christine and Alvin.